When Abdulhamid II first stepped into the shadowy halls of power, the Ottoman Empire was already gasping for breath. The world called it the sick man of Europe, but that phrase barely scratched the surface of its misery. Imagine an empire once feared and respected, now reduced to a pawn on the chessboard of Europe's great powers. The treasury was empty, the streets buzzed with unrest, and foreign bankers held the keys to the empire's future. Even the taxes collected from the poorest villages were funneled straight into the hands of London and Paris, leaving the Sultan's own people in chains within their homeland. But the crisis didn't end with empty coffers. The empire was fracturing from within, torn apart by waves of rebellion in the Balkans. Nationalist fires, first sparked by the French Revolution, now raged in places like Greece, Serbia, and Bulgaria. Each uprising chipped away at the Sultan's authority, while Russia watched hungrily from the north, eager to carve its path to the warm waters of the Mediterranean. The Ottomans were surrounded by enemies, but the real danger was the rot spreading inside their own borders. And as if that wasn't enough, the royal court itself had become a nest of conspiracies. Sultans were deposed, assassinated, or driven mad in quick succession. The throne was no longer a seat of power. It was a trap, baited with gold and lined with daggers. When Abdulhamid took the crown, few envied him. To rule the Ottoman Empire at that moment was to inherit a burning house, with every door and window watched by rivals, traitors, and foreign spies. The empire was on the brink, and the new sultan was stepping into a storm that threatened to swallow him whole. But what Abdulhamid did next would shock the world and change the fate of millions. But the Ottoman throne was never just a seat, it was a battlefield. And blood was its constant companion. In the years before Abdulhamid's rise, the palace corridors echoed with whispers of betrayal and the heavy silence that follows a sudden death. Sultans came and went with alarming speed, each one falling victim to the ruthless power struggles that defined the era. Abdulhamid's own uncle, Sultan Abdulaziz, was forced from power in a coup led by ambitious ministers. Just days later, he was found dead in his chambers, his wrists slashed. Officially, it was called a suicide, but rumors swirled that it was a carefully staged murder, a warning to anyone who dared defy the hidden hands pulling the strings. The chaos didn't stop there. Abdulhamid's elder brother Murad V inherited the throne next, but the trauma of his uncle's fate shattered his mind. Declared insane after only 3 months, he was quietly removed, leaving the empire desperate for stability. It was in this climate of fear and suspicion that Abdulhamid, just 34 years old, was thrust into power. Many believed he wouldn't last long, that he'd be the next victim in a deadly game that had already claimed too many lives. But Abdulhamid was different. Unlike the pleasure-seeking princes before him, he had spent years studying politics, watching the court's every move, and preparing for the day when survival would depend on more than just royal blood. Some say his rise was orchestrated by cunning ministers who thought they could control him, but others believe Abdulhamid outsmarted them all, turning their schemes to his own advantage. In a palace where trust was a luxury no one could afford, Abdulhamid's sharp mind and quiet determination set him apart. The throne was stained with blood, but for the first time in years, it was occupied by a man who understood the true cost of power and was willing to pay it. Yet, as he settled into his new role, the real test was only just beginning. The empire's enemies were circling, and the next move would decide not just his fate, but the fate of a dying dynasty. Abdulhamid's first months on the throne were a crash course in survival. Barely had he adjusted the crown when disaster struck from the north. Russia declared war, and the Ottoman armies were no match for the Tsar's relentless advance. The empire's ancient capital, Istanbul, trembled as Russian troops closed in, and the Sultan was forced to sign the humiliating Treaty of San Stefano. In a single stroke, the Ottomans lost vast territories in Europe. Serbia, Romania, and Montenegro broke free. Bulgaria slipped from their grasp, and even distant Britain snatched Cyprus under the guise of protection. It was a feeding frenzy, with every rival tearing off a piece of the once mighty empire. For Abdulhamid, it was a brutal awakening. The West, he realized, had no friends, only interests. But defeat did not break him. Instead, it transformed him. The idealist who had once dreamed of reform became a hardened realist, determined to outwit the wolves circling his realm. Abdulhamid began to play a new game, one that would earn him a reputation as a political grandmaster. He saw that the European powers, for all their talk of civilization, were locked in their own rivalries. Russia wanted access to the Mediterranean, Britain feared for its route to India, France eyed Africa, and Germany, hungry for influence, was eager to make its mark. Abdulhamid's genius was to pit these powers against each other, never letting any one nation gain the upper hand. He courted Germany, inviting their engineers and military advisors to modernize his army and build ambitious projects like the Berlin-Baghdad Railway, a move that sent shockwaves through London and Paris. When Britain threatened, he whispered warnings to France. When Russia meddled in the Balkans, he played Austria and Britain off against them. Every move was calculated, every alliance temporary, every promise a tool to buy time. This strategy, known as divide and survive, kept the empire afloat far longer than anyone expected. Abdulhamid's diplomatic maneuvers baffled his enemies and frustrated their ambitions. He was no longer just a ruler, he was a chess player, moving pieces on a board where a single mistake could mean the end of everything. Yet, as he played this dangerous game, a new idea was taking shape in his mind, one that would become his most powerful weapon against the world's mightiest empires. But even the sharpest mind can't predict every move. And the next chapter of Abdulhamid's reign would test his cunning like never before. While European powers schemed and plotted, Abdulhamid quietly reached for a weapon more powerful than any army: the unity of faith. He understood that the Ottoman Empire was a patchwork of nations, languages, and loyalties, but there was one thread that could bind them all: Islam. As Caliph, Abdulhamid held a title no other ruler in the world could claim. He wasn't just a king, he was the spiritual leader of millions, from the deserts of Arabia to the mountains of Central Asia, from the bustling cities of India to the farthest reaches of Africa. This was his secret weapon, and he wielded it with remarkable skill. The Sultan's vision was bold. If the empire could not be held together by Turkish identity alone, perhaps it could be saved by rallying Muslims everywhere under the banner of the Caliphate. This idea, known as Pan-Islamism, sent shockwaves through the colonial capitals of Europe. British officials in India, French governors in North Africa, and Russian czars in the Caucasus all grew nervous. Rumors spread that a single word from Istanbul, a call for unity or even rebellion, could ignite unrest across their vast empires. The mere possibility was enough to keep them on edge, forcing them to think twice before tightening the screws on the Ottomans. Abdulhamid didn't just talk about unity, he made it real. His most ambitious project, the Hejaz Railway, was more than a feat of engineering. Stretching from Damascus to Medina, it was a lifeline connecting the heart of the empire to Islam's holiest cities. But the empire was broke, so where would the money come from? Abdulhamid turned to the global Muslim community, appealing for donations. The response was overwhelming. From Indian merchants to Indonesian farmers, Muslims sent what they could, and the railway became a living symbol of shared faith and purpose. This show of unity terrified the European powers. Secret reports and diplomatic cables from the time revealed just how seriously they took the threat of a united Muslim world. Some even whispered that Abdulhamid was preparing to unleash a spiritual uprising if pushed too far. Whether or not he ever intended to, the fear alone gave him leverage at every negotiation table. For a while, it seemed as if the Caliph's spiritual authority might succeed where armies and treaties had failed. But as Abdulhamid's influence grew abroad, new dangers began to fester at home, dangers that no title or railway could keep at Payitaht. With enemies lurking at every border and conspiracies festering within the palace walls, Abdulhamid made a decision that would define his rule and haunt his legacy. He tightened his grip on power, dissolving the parliament and suspending the constitution that had been forced upon him. In the eyes of the West, this was the death of democracy, a move that transformed the Sultan into a symbol of tyranny. Newspapers in London and Paris branded him a dictator, and the nickname Red Sultan began to circulate, dripping with accusation and fear. But for Abdulhamid, this was not about personal ambition. He believed that only a strong, unyielding hand could keep the empire from shattering completely. In his mind, a sinking ship could not be saved by debate. It needed a captain who would not flinch, no matter the storm. This iron rule was soon put to the test. In the eastern provinces, Armenian nationalists, inspired by the same wave of revolutions sweeping Europe, rose up against the Sultan's authority. Russia, always eager to weaken the Ottomans, fanned the flames of rebellion. The situation spiraled quickly, and when an assassination attempt nearly claimed Abdulhamid's life, his patience snapped. The response was swift and brutal. The rebellion was crushed with a force that shocked even his own supporters. No one knows exactly how many lives were lost, but the violence left a scar that would never fully heal. Western critics seized on the tragedy, using it to paint Abdulhamid as a bloodthirsty tyrant, a ruler who would stop at nothing to preserve his throne. Yet, the story was never so simple. Supporters of the Sultan argued that he was fighting for survival, forced into impossible choices by the chaos around him. They point out that the empire was already on the verge of collapse, and that any sign of weakness would have invited total destruction. To them, Abdulhamid was not a monster, but a desperate guardian, doing what he believed was necessary to hold the empire together. Even today, historians remain divided. Was the Sultan's iron fist a last, necessary defense against anarchy, or did it only deepen the wounds that would eventually destroy the empire from within? As the world debated his methods, Abdulhamid faced a new kind of challenge, one that would test not just his resolve, but his very soul. An offer arrived at his court, promising salvation for the empire's debts, but at a price that would shake the foundations of the Muslim world. The next chapter in Abdulhamid's story would not be written in blood, but in the currency of loyalty, faith, and betrayal. As the empire staggered under the weight of debt and division, a new figure emerged from the heart of Europe: Theodor Herzl, the founder of the Zionist movement. Herzl's dream was as ambitious as it was controversial: to gather Jews from across the world and establish a homeland in Palestine, then still under Ottoman rule. But there was one immovable obstacle in his path: Sultan Abdulhamid II, the Caliph and protector of Jerusalem. Herzl believed that every man had his price, and with the Ottoman treasury empty, he was certain he could strike a deal that no desperate ruler could refuse. Between 1896 and 1902, Herzl made repeated journeys to Istanbul, each time inching closer to the Sultan's inner circle. He came armed with promises. The Zionist movement would pay off the empire's crushing debts, flood the Ottoman coffers with gold, and even launch a campaign to restore Abdulhamid's battered reputation in the West. All he wanted in return was permission for Jewish settlement in Palestine, a foothold that could one day become a nation. For any ordinary king, the offer would have been irresistible. The empire was bankrupt, the creditors were circling, and the world was watching for any sign of weakness. But Abdulhamid was no ordinary king. He saw Palestine not as a bargaining chip, but as a sacred trust home to Jerusalem, the first Qibla, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. To him, the land was woven into the spiritual fabric of the Muslim world, a legacy that could not be sold for any price. When Herzl finally secured an audience, he laid out his proposal with confidence, expecting gratitude or at least consideration. Instead, the Sultan's response was cold and unwavering. "I cannot sell even an inch of this land," Abdulhamid declared, "because it does not belong to me, but to my nation. My people have watered this soil with their blood, and it is not mine to give away." This refusal sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles. Some reports claim that Herzl left the palace stunned, unable to comprehend a ruler who would turn down such a lifeline. Others suggest that this moment sealed Abdulhamid's fate, marking him as an enemy of powerful interests in Europe. Rumors have swirled ever since. Was the Sultan's downfall hastened by his defiance? Or was it simply the final act in a tragedy already set in motion? What is certain is that Abdulhamid's stand became legendary, a symbol of resistance that echoed far beyond the walls of his palace. But, as the Sultan held firm against foreign pressure, a new threat was rising from within his own empire. The next storm would not come from bankers or diplomats, but from the restless hearts and minds of his own people, those who had once looked to him for guidance, and now saw only a shadow of the past. While Abdulhamid stood firm against foreign demands, a new and unexpected danger was quietly gathering strength within his own empire. The seeds of this threat had been planted by the Sultan himself years earlier, when he sent promising young officers and students to Europe to learn the secrets of science and progress. But instead of returning with only technical knowledge, these young minds came back burning with revolutionary ideas: liberty, equality, and nationalism. They called themselves the Young Turks, and they saw Abdulhamid's iron rule not as protection, but as the very chain holding the empire back from modernity. The Young Turks were not a single group, but a restless coalition of army officers, intellectuals, and exiles. Many had tasted the freedom of Paris, Berlin, and Geneva, and they returned home determined to drag the Ottoman Empire into a new age. In their eyes, the Sultan's insistence on absolute power was the root of every crisis. They blamed him for the empire's stagnation, for its humiliations abroad, and for the suffocating atmosphere that stifled any hope of reform. Their solution was radical: restore the constitution, revive the parliament, and build a modern, secular, and Turkish nation-state. But the Young Turks were not alone in their ambitions. European powers, frustrated by Abdulhamid's pan-Islamic policies and his refusal to play by their rules, quietly encouraged the rebels. Secret funds and whispered promises flowed across borders, fueling the growing unrest. The real turning point came in 1908, when the Third Army, stationed in Macedonia and filled with Young Turk sympathizers, openly rebelled. They demanded the restoration of the constitution and threatened to march on Istanbul if their demands were not met. Faced with the prospect of civil war, Abdulhamid made a fateful choice. Rather than unleash a bloodbath to save his throne, he agreed to the rebels' demands. The constitution was restored, and for a brief moment, the streets of Istanbul erupted in celebration. People believed a new dawn had arrived, that the empire would finally be reborn. But the peace was an illusion. Within a year, a counter-rebellion by conservative forces gave the Young Turks the excuse they needed to move decisively. The Action Army marched on the capital, imposed martial law, and forced Abdulhamid to abdicate. The Sultan, who had outmaneuvered foreign empires and refused to sell his soul, was now brought down by the very generation he had hoped would save the empire. As he was led away from the palace, Abdulhamid must have wondered if his greatest strength, his iron grip, had become his fatal weakness. The empire he had held together for decades was now in the hands of men who believed they could build something new from its ashes. But history would soon reveal just how high the cost of revolution could be. The fall of Abdulhamid II marked the end of an era, but the empire's troubles were only beginning. The Young Turks, who had promised a new dawn, quickly found themselves overwhelmed by the storms they had unleashed. Within just a few years, the Ottoman Empire began to unravel at a pace no one could have imagined. In 1911, Italy seized Libya, the empire's last African province, while the government in Istanbul could do little more than watch. The following year, the Balkans erupted in violence as Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro joined forces to drive the Ottomans out of Europe. In a matter of weeks, centuries of imperial rule vanished, leaving only memories and bitter regrets. But the true disaster struck in 1914, when the Young Turks, desperate to restore the empire's lost glory, gambled everything by entering the First World War. It was a decision that would prove catastrophic. The Ottoman armies, already weakened by years of conflict and internal strife, were no match for the combined might of the Allied powers. The war dragged on for 4 brutal years, leaving the empire shattered and exhausted. By 1918, British forces occupied Baghdad and Jerusalem, and even the heartland of Anatolia was under foreign control. The once mighty Ottoman Empire, which had stood for 6 centuries, was now little more than a memory, its lands divided among the victors. As the empire crumbled, Abdulhamid lived out his final days under house arrest, a fallen guardian watching the world he had fought to protect slip away. He died in 1918, just months before the official end of the war, his warnings about the dangers of reckless change echoing in the ruins of his former realm. The Young Turks' dream of freedom and progress had ended not in triumph, but in devastation. In 1924, the final blow came. The Caliphate was abolished, and Turkey declared itself a secular republic, severing the last ties to the empire's spiritual legacy. The fate of Palestine, which Abdulhamid had refused to sell, even for untold riches, was now decided by foreign powers. Britain took control, and the groundwork was laid for the creation of a new state, one that would reshape the Middle East for generations to come. The vultures had descended, and the spoils of the sick man of Europe were divided without mercy. Looking back, the legacy of Abdulhamid II remains fiercely debated. Was he a hero who held the empire together against impossible odds, or a villain whose iron rule only delayed the inevitable? What is certain is that his story is a warning, a reminder that the greatest threats often come not from outside, but from within. And as history moved on, the world was left to wonder, could anyone have saved the Ottoman Empire, or was its fate sealed long before the last sultan fell?